Welcome to this 3D modeling class where we will create a Ghostbuster trap so we can start to learn the 3D modeling tools inside of Maya. Anytime you start modeling something, you want to look at reference. In case you don't know what a Ghostbuster trap is, you can just Google it and find some images. And we're going to use this just as a template, not really as an exact match that we're going to try to get, but just, there's a kind of box here that has different knobs and a handle on it and that kind of a thing. And that's kind of the general kind of direction we're going to try to model this object in so we can start to learn some Maya. So I'm going to switch back to Maya. And anytime you start using Maya, you want to set your project. This is something to remember from here on out. This isn't just some thing that, you want to do sometimes. This is, from day one when I was learning Maya till you work in a big studio, you want to set your project. Big studios have their own way of doing stuff, but a small studio maybe, you want to set your project. If you go to File, we'll go down to Set Project. And the reason this is important is because anytime you have, later down the road, you have textures, say you're doing a cloth simulation and you want to cache that out, or all these other technical things that we'll get into later, we need somewhere for Maya to save all those things to reference into the scene. So in my directory, I've made a Maya folder and I'm going to set that. And it will ask you to create a default workspace. And typically this just means, it's going to save, kind of unimportant stuff like what kind of view did you have open? Was it a perspective or a side view? And, what kind of preferences maybe you had for that workspace. So you can just say create default workspace. And you won't have to do that again. You'll have to do that the first time you set a project. We're also going to go to the project window, the other option here under project. You can see project in gray. We only have two options. We've already done set project. The project is set. So let's go to project window and we get all of these different folder options here. And if you don't see these names typed out here, you can go to edit, reset settings, and it should fill all of those out for you. And this will create folders, like I mentioned a moment ago, for caches, for images, and mostly we're going to be using for scenes, because when we save a Maya file, if we just hit Command S like you would in a Word document or whatever, just to save the file, it's going to save a .mb or a .ma. And that's M for Maya and A or B, depending on if you save an ASCII or a binary file. But that's not that important right now. Let's just hit accept and it'll make all these folders. So when we go to File Save, let's go File Save Scene, and because we haven't done it yet, it'll open up this dialog box. And now we have this current project. It knows where our current project is, and we have all those folders that it had listed out. And anytime we're saving a scene, we want to save it in the scenes folder. And you can see that it is under our project that I defined as Maya. And now I can name it whatever I want, and I can choose to be an ASCII or a binary, and it doesn't really matter, to be honest, for our purposes. So I'm going to name that Ghostbuster Trap and hit save. So now we have the project saved, and that way if we need to move the project to another computer, it will have reference a path to the project settings, so it'll know where the textures are or anything else like that. So let's get started and model this Ghostbuster trap. So let's take a look at this reference, and we basically have a rectangle with a cylinder handle. So let's start with the most basic elements first, and then we'll add detail later. Because anytime you do modeling, whether it's hard or organic, let's start with the simplest shapes first and then add detail later. We don't want to start with the detail on really anything. And the same is true for animation. Most art, you start with the basics first. So let's create the rectangle and the handle, because those are the biggest, most obvious things. So in Maya, there's a couple different ways we can create things. We have this shelf here, the poly modeling shelf. And there are curves and surfaces here, which, it looks like they have similar things, but these are called NURBS surfaces. And these aren't very useful for modeling and animation. They sometimes are used for kind of just to create controls on rigs, to create paths to revolve a shape around, or constrain a camera to a path, or fly a plane down a curved path, something like that. But for our purposes, we're not going to be using NURBS surfaces. We're going to be doing poly modeling, where we have vertices, edges, and faces. So let's create the rectangle. We can click this rectangle right here and zoom in by right-clicking and holding down Alt and left-clicking to rotate around, if you remember. We could also create that by doing the polygon primitives, and we could pop this off if we wanted to and create a bunch of these cubes. That's another way to do it. But now that we have this, we can go over to our channel box here, and we can see we have a polycube 1. And we can see it's called pcube1 here, and it's also called pcube1 here, and it's highlighted, so we know this is what's highlighted. And I point out these things because, we can translate this thing around different ways, and that's reflected here. But there's also other options. When we pop this down, we can get subdivisions. So if we wanted more subdivisions, we can go to subdivision width, height, and depth, and those will do different kind of dimensions on this, depending on if we need more geometry. But we'll get to that in a minute. Let's first make the basic shape. So I'll go to width, and I'll make this a little longer and a little wider and tall. So now we have something that approximates the size, and I'm going to go ahead and turn on the anti-aliasing and the ambient occlusion to help us visualize this. I'm also going to lift this up, and we can see, depending on the width, height, and depth, if I just change this to 5 and these to 2, then I know the height is 2, that this needs to go up 1 to be able to be sitting right on the floor, right? Because it's measuring from the center. Wherever our manipulator is, that's where it's measuring from. So if it's a height of 2 and this is in the middle, then it's 1 to the floor, right? From where the manipulator is. If we bring this down to the floor, it's going to be at 0. So that's one way to kind of know how it's calculating what these numbers are exactly. So we have that rectangle. Now let's create the handle. We can click the cylinder here and drag this up. You can hit W if you don't have the manipulator selected yet. You can hit E to rotate this over. And to get it exact, we can just type in 90. You can do -90 or 90. For us, it doesn't really matter right now. And we could scale this down, or we could use, similarly, these types of attributes over here. So we could reduce the radius, or we could, just scale it down with the scale tool by hitting R. And let's move this to one side and move it up. And then we can make another cube a couple different ways. We could duplicate this one. We could hit Command D, and now we have another one that we can scale and do all these things to. But you can see when you duplicate, just with the shortcut, you don't have that option anymore, right? We don't have that polycube input that we had here. So sometimes it's nice to just use the basic tools to make sure that we have this history here that later we can go back in and change if we want to. So let's bring this here and scale it down a little bit. And let's talk about some ways to align things. So, if we wanted to get this to be exactly on this edge, it might be kind of hard to use the manipulator, back and forth. There are a couple different things we can do to move things around and be very specific. Of course, we can go up here and type in a number, but we could just be typing all day and we might not get exactly visually what it looks like. So to know that we have snapped to that, we can use the snapping tools. But the snapping tools go based off of where the manipulator is. So for example, if I hold down V on the keyboard, that means vertice. It's going to snap to vertice. And just to show you what the components that we're dealing with, to know what a vertice even is, let me break this down even further. So if we take this square, I'm just going to isolate it with this little button here, isolate select. I right click. Now I can see and change my selection mode to edge, vertex, vertex face, face, or back to object mode, which is what we're currently in. We're in object mode. That's also denoted by this little button up here in the top left. If we want to go to component mode, we can click this button. And again, it'll show that if you hold it down, or if you hover over it rather. And you can see the different kind of components that we can select here. And we can isolate those. So now we're selecting the lines. Or if we go back to this one and deselect the line, we get the vertice. So now we can edit the basic components of all the polygons here. And if we want to do this quickly, we can right click and hold, drag up and go to edge mode now. And now we can adjust the edges. So that just gives you a quick idea of what the components are that make up a polygon. So I just went to object mode to get back in so I can select the whole thing. I could also go up here and click this middle button to go back into object mode. I'm going to unisolate this now so we can go back to our model. So the next thing we need to understand is how to change where the manipulator is. So if I hold down V like I was describing earlier, and I middle mouse drag, if we click and hold on middle mouse, this is going to snap to vertices. You can see it's trying to snap to the corners of the box or the vertices of the cylinder. So, but we don't want the center to snap to it. We want the edge to snap to it. So we're going to need to change where this center pivot is. To do that, we can hold down D. And now we get a different type of manipulator here. And if we hold down V while we're holding down D, we can also snap the pivot to a vertice without the object moving, because we're just changing where the pivot is now. So if I let go of both, now we get the regular manipulator. If this doesn't come back, you can hit W to make sure that pops back to be the manipulator. So now when we move this, the whole thing moves around. Now what we can do is go and hold down V and middle mouse drag and isolate the up value. So we're only going to go up, and you can see it snapped upward. Now we can hold down the X axis and it will snap to the backside, which it seems like it has. So now we don't want this pivot here anymore. How do we get that back? That's not a big deal. We go to modify and we go down to center pivot. When we click this, now the pivot is back in the center, and we can move the pivot around later again if we want to, but now it's there. Also remember, you can see that the axis here is yellow. So if I was to start middle mouse dragging, it's going to be isolated on this no matter what I do or where I move my mouse, if it's middle mouse dragged. So, you just want to make sure that you understand how it's isolating these axes as you click them. That's one thing that, stumps a lot of people when they're just starting out, like, why can't I move this in a different axis? It's because we, selected that one, and now it's thinking we want to isolate that. So this looks very basic right now, but I want to give you a quick introduction into how to create things, manipulate them, snap things around. And in the next lesson, we're going to take this further and start adding details and learn a few more modeling tools inside of Maya. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.